Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everyone. I have a special guest here with me today. It's Hex Marie, and we're going to be talking about German folk magic and Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic, the differences and the similarities. I know that a lot of people have been asking me about this exact topic in my comment section, so I thought, who better to invite onto my channel for this than Hex Marie? So would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, online I go by Hex Marie, and I am a German American folk witch. I live in Utah, but my family, my mom's side is from Pennsylvania, and so that's where I picked up this interest in Pennsylvania Dutch folklore and folk magic.
I'll link Hex Marie's stuff down below in the description for everyone who is interested. And I'll think that we just jump right into the questions. The first thing that I ask everyone when they come on my channel is, how did you get into your specific spiritual path that you're on right now?
Okay, so it's kind of a winding road for me because before I got into Pennsylvania Dutch and German American folk magic, I had like 10 years in, I don't know, pantheistic, pagan, agnostic spirituality. So I was raised Mormon, and that's a whole journey, very, very strict. And I left about when I got married when I was 23, and then it took me another 10 years before I discovered this path. And what really led me onto this path was having my daughter. I had a daughter in 2019, and that was like a really difficult experience, but it also really like opened me up. Like I felt very viscerally connected to my ancestors, and also that I really needed support from my ancestors. And then 2020 happened, and we were all forced totally inside, and that really created an opportunity for me to go deeper than I thought. I was like, I figured everything out. I'm so deep. And there was this whole other layer of exploration for me. And so that was when I really first started feeling the presence of my ancestors and feeling encouraged to explore Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture. It started for me getting interested in Proctor, learning to write Proctor. That was like, I don't know, very a very visceral way to feel connected to them and feel my ancestors' presence. And then probably in late 2019, I I had come across like Frau Holle and Frau Bertha in some of my reading, but I was kind of like, oh, I'm an American mutt, whatever. Didn't really put two and two, how like, oh, this is directly relates to me. These are direct ancestral practices and spirits. And having my daughter kind of made me put two and two together. And I started looking to my ancestry. I'm like, oh, I'm not like a random mix. I'm like really Pennsylvania Dutch. I'm a quarter Pennsylvania Dutch. And then all my other lines are also half German at least. And so just realizing like, oh, I'm not just an American mutt, like I'm like 3/4 German. And then learning about Frau Holle and Frau Bertha and diving into that was really, I don't even know how to put it. It's like maybe enlightening, but it just felt like what I always needed to hear. And especially as a mom, their example of what it could mean to be a woman was so much more expansive than what had been given me. And it included all the dark things I was experiencing and the like fierceness it takes to be a mom. And so that I ended up just like jumping in with both feet at that point, and that's how I got here.
That's really fascinating to hear that your transition into parenthood actually got you deeper into this folk magic oriented path, which, I mean, folk magic inherently is more of a communal experience. It builds more of
Mhm.
a community that also exists in our contemporary times and is not just something that happened like maybe 1,000 years ago. So
Mhm.
I feel that aspect of your how your life kind of thrust you into this specific path is very interesting. How your roots got kind of uncovered when you went through this big life transition, which
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in these times of transition, in these liminal periods, are always like these times when we really like discover who we really are almost.
Yeah, and like having like the experience of carrying a child too is very interesting because in a lot of ways it's similar to other life transitions, but then like your body is actually like a conduit for the ancestors because like literally like DNA gets repurposed, like you're like that's material passed down from the ancestors. And also it is so liminal because I really felt I had a hard pregnancy, so I really felt like I'm on I'm on the threshold of life and death the whole time. And definitely like Frau Bertha specifically and Frau Holla, they both, I don't know, they really were a source of strength for me in that transition. And I feel because I didn't have children until I was married like 10 years. And I had already had, I'm an illustrator, so I'd had all this career experience, and a lot of that had to be put on the back burner, and that was a really hard identity transition. And I think this path has been very comforting and helped me find my footing. And honestly, I feel a lot more grounded now than I ever have in the past. And it is like a whole new world of experience. And then also getting to culturally connect with my Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, because we're going to get into that as we talk, but that's something that was kind of invisible to me, and I hadn't put this energy into connecting to it. And so being able to find groups on Facebook and stuff where there's other people with these niche interests has really been great.
A lot of people in the US, I feel like, know about the Pennsylvania Dutch, or at least have heard the name before they know that
Mhm.
this exists as a concept. And in Germany, I would say this isn't necessarily the case. I feel like people here are aware that there are German diasporic communities all over the world, but they don't really have any like knowledge of the Pennsylvania Dutch specifically. So for
Mhm.
anyone who's German who's potentially listening to this, how would you kind of explain who the Pennsylvania Dutch are, what their culture, history, and language is to someone who has never heard about that before?
Okay, so first we have to address the whole Dutch thing
Yeah.
because Dutch in this instance is using an old archaic English term that used to refer to any Germanic speaker. So when people migrated out of Central Europe and Germany, they would go along the Rhine and end up in the Netherlands. So it's like everyone kind of came through the Netherlands, and so they're all Dutch, all German dialects, including Swiss people or Austrian people. So it was a umbrella term. And so that really, Germany didn't exist at this time because the migration actually started in the early 1700s. And what happened is, um, so specifically from southwestern Germany and then the nearby areas, so in Switzerland and Alsace,
Mhm.
there was a very big migration in the early 1700s because Pennsylvania had opened up and there were tracts written in German that were talking about Penn's Woods. And a lot of people in Southwest Germany had gotten very, it was very bad economically, and they'd gotten tired of the constant war, and they'd gotten through the 30 Years' War, and then now France and Germany or proto Germany were fighting over each other, and they were like, we're done with this. And so the majority of the immigrants came from we call it the Palatinate, but I think the Pfalz
Yeah.
is the proper name. And so the majority of people came from the Pfalz and surrounding areas, and they settled in Pennsylvania before America existed. And they created their own little German community in Pennsylvania, where up until very recently, they still spoke what we call Dutch or Pennsylvania Dutch. And that language is actually very similar to modern day Falsish. I might be saying that wrong, but they're mutually intelligible. There's obviously differences because when you have a diaspora community, it becomes a hybrid culture, and they're influenced by the new land that they lived in. They're influenced by their new neighbors, which for the Pennsylvania Dutch would have been mostly some English and Scottish people who lived in Pennsylvania at the time. And then also there's things like the new vocabulary as technologies take off, things like automobiles. The word for that is different in Pennsylvania Dutch than in Falsish because they came up with different solutions because it didn't exist when they moved. And so the community there ended up being a migration hub. So between the like 1720-ish to like 1850, most people who came to America from Germany would have ended up in Pennsylvania because they want to end up a place that's familiar. Everyone spoke Germany. No, everyone spoke German. Everyone spoke German. English was their second language if they spoke English. And they really brought a lot of their folk culture with them and continued doing it. This migration was very particular because it was mostly communities of peasants coming over, and whole families and communities would arrange to come together. So it wasn't just like lone migrants. It was like they would send, an aunt and uncle would come over. They'd send the older kids over to like earn some money. A lot of times they were indentured servants at first to earn their passage to America. And then what also happened is the migrants from all over came and they learned that new language, Dutch. So even if you had migrants that came from Berlin or Northwest Germany, when they came to Pennsylvania, they would have learned the Palatinate dialect. And so this culture went really strong for a long time. People don't really realize, and it wasn't until starting in World War I, a lot of the more outskirts of the Pennsylvania Dutch communities would have stopped speaking German because Germany was the enemy, and it became a liability to be seen as German. But then in the heart of Pennsylvania, it wasn't until World War II that people started to stopped speaking German as their primary language. So this community, I've noticed people in Germany really don't know about it. And it's really interesting. There's a documentary. I'm going to butcher this because I think it's a tongue twister, but there's a documentary called Hibbede. It's like means hither and thither, I think.
I've watched that. It's on YouTube, right?
I think so. And they have a full length. I don't know if the full length is on YouTube. And then there's one in German that's a second one that came out recently. But it's very interesting to see people from the Pfalz experience Pennsylvania Dutch culture and just be like, oh my gosh, they're speaking Falsish. Like I had no idea there's someone speaking our little dialect, a whole community. So yeah, hopefully I think that covers it. A lot of in America, the Amish and the Mennonites, which are Anabaptist sects, are very synonymous with Pennsylvania Dutch, but they're actually quite the minority. It would have been about 90% of the migrants were just economic migrants who were actually Protestant, so Lutheran or Reformed. And then those religious minorities, they're very iconic. They dress in old-timey clothes, and they still, to different levels, shun technology. and so they're very iconic, but that isn't, most of the culture of Pennsylvania Dutch culture comes from what they would call the fancy Dutch. The Anabaptists are the plain Dutch, and the Lutherans are the fancy Dutch. We also have like a good amount of immigrants in the Pennsylvania Dutch community from Switzerland or from Baden, or Alsace, but those dialects show up very slightly
Mm.
because I think it was just like you move to a new place and then you're like, okay, I just got to make this work now. And even the like today, because most of the fancy Dutch have given up speaking German by this point, but the Anabaptist communities and the Amish and Mennonites, even though that most of their ancestry, from what I understand, is probably mostly from Switzerland, or a much larger proportion of their ancestry is Swiss, but they still speak a Palatinate dialect.
Again, I just tried to look for the documentary that you mentioned.
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure that I've watched that before on YouTube somewhere. I couldn't find it right
Uh-huh.
now, but if I find it, I'm going to put the link in the video description.
Okay. And
And
it's like on Amazon. I know that I watched it like probably a year and a half ago. So, and they have like a YouTube channel too. I'm not sure. Half of it is in Falsish, and so then I'm like, I can't understand because I unfortunately don't speak Pennsylvania Dutch.
are there like any resources for English speakers to learn Pennsylvania Dutch, or has it like more or less fully died out now?
So now there is starting to be a revival. It's like I guess the kind of dust had to settle of World War II, and that took quite a while. And so now there is a revival, and young people are getting more and more interested in the culture in lots of aspects. And so for the language specifically, local colleges do teach Pennsylvania Dutch courses that you can take online. And so hopefully soon I'll be able to do that. It's just like, a money thing at this point. But yeah, so you can get Pennsylvania Dutch like level 1 and 2 in online courses. And then there is a Pennsylvania Dutch press called Masshoff Press that reprints a lot of the cultural books and historical, whether it's like anthropological surveys, or whether it is the Pennsylvania Dutch dictionaries. You can get it from them. So yeah, that's been kind of like a stretch goal. I'm busy right now, but yeah.
Yeah, you already mentioned the folk practices that the PA Dutch brought over to the Americas. And I'm curious to learn more about those. Like, what would you say are like the core tenets of Pennsylvania Dutch folk practices? Like, what do they use spells? Do they have certain philosophies in their folk belief or specific tools? Anything?
So um so talking about this, I feel like we it all comes as a package. There's a term that a Pennsylvania Dutch scholar called Don Yoder, I think it's Don Yoder, definitely Yoder, that he came up with, which he called Folkways. So that includes both the folklore, because back in the 50s when he was working, folklore just meant the written material and the oral material, but there's all these other parts of culture and the material culture, the people's religious beliefs, the food they eat, all of those things are a unit that operate together, and you can't really separate them. So to characterize Pennsylvania Dutch culture, the way that I would characterize it in general is that it's very down to earth and earthy. It's very like work hard. We're known for being really hard workers, but it's also a love of life and a joy of life. So very like work hard, play hard. And there was a German word, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this. I was looking up the pronunciation last night, but there was a word that I came across in one of Don Yoder's books, where it's gonna do so bad. Gemütlichkeit.
Gemütlichkeit, maybe?
I think that's right. Yes. Okay, he said
Is-
that feeling of cozy togetherness and like getting together, and especially around like the holidays. That was something, reading that word, I was like, oh, that puts language to something I experienced with my family, because when I would go visit my Pennsylvania Dutch great grandparents, they would host us all in the summers and we'd be sitting all out there, and it's like the only thing is the world in the world is being together, and you're really enjoying being together, and you're not like in my dad's family you're not bringing up politics or anything people are going to fight about. We're going to have a good time, and that feeling of closeness and coziness that I definitely feel. And my mom was talking about it this holiday season, talking about how in Pennsylvania at Christmas everyone was so, it was, everyone had a good mood and everyone was so sweet and kind and happy at Christmas in Pennsylvania, and how it isn't like that here. And so I think it's very much that rural, down to earth culture. And we also like love our food, and we're also well known for our folk art. So there is a how do you put this, visual art called Froctor that includes the Froctor type, but these illustrated documents and like baptismal blessings and things that are done by hand and very rough, but like very fun. And those, the reason for those is that they had the custom of keeping that paperwork for good luck reasons, keeping it on the family Bible. But when they came to America, they didn't have printing presses anymore for a while. And so people had to just make do themselves. And then also just very colorful, painting hearts and tulips on every surface of the house. And I think it's very familiar to the folk culture in Germany and the old folk art. It would be very similar, maybe a little rougher in some ways. And part of that too is there's this love of color, even though they made all the pigments themselves, like from making red pigments from iron and different plants. They loved color. And I think part of that was because in Germany, there were sumptuary laws where they weren't allowed to wear color. I found out recently, because I love the German folk costumes, but it's like, oh man, we weren't even allowed to wear any color. No wonder we came to America. I do it, but so okay, let me get back to topic. So that's kind of like the vibe of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And then the folk culture and folk practices as far as folk magic go are very intertwined with all of that, because the Pennsylvania Dutch are also known as to be very superstitious people. So they're down to earth and logical in that way, but also very superstitious. And so there's a lot of things like lunar calendars, like there's all these farmer rules about when you plant different things. So root vegetables, you need to plant those on a new moon so that they root deep in the earth, and plants that you take the leaves from, those you need to plant during the full moon or the waxing moon. And then there's all sorts of remedies. So you would have, okay, sorry, you can edit this out. It's like too much to talk about. I'm like, okay, let's get back to folk magic. So the heart of it is going to be actually verbal spells and incantations that are passed down from person to person. There are also probably, you'll find a lot of use of the Bible, and then also almanacs, because the early American almanacs, some of the very first almanacs in America were made by the Pennsylvania Dutch. And so astrology was always very important. And then as far as tools go, you're mostly going to see very like practical everyday items. So you'll see using string, knives, canes, different vegetables, things like that. And anyway, I talked about too many things. You can get me back on track.
Yeah, I mean, that was like a nice kind of roundabout tour throughout the Pennsylvania Dutch folk customs. So I guess
Uh-huh.
everyone kind of got like a taste of the different aspects of PA Dutch folk culture.
Uh-huh.
Again, you would probably have like a more interesting conversation with someone who was from southwestern Germany, who would like
Uh-huh.
know the Pfälzisch culture better than I do, because I've never been there. I'm from the
Uh-huh.
Northwest. The Pfalz is like very foreign to me. I cannot understand the people there for the life of me when they
Oh
speak in their
yeah.
dialect.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I've watched both Hereditary, but then also on YouTube there's some like local falsish television programs. And I watched a few things where they're kind of, it was humorous, but they're kind of showing different funny falsish customs. And it was like such a surreal experience because on one level it is so familiar, like it just the way people are in their bodies. There's something that they were making fun of, which is like I guess if you're getting someone's attention in the faults, they'll go, huh? Huh? And it's like, I'm like, oh my gosh. And it just was like my grandma and my mom. My mom does that. It's like they're sitting there, kind of like, I don't know, kind of reminds me of like little frogs sitting there. They were at a wine garden, so they're really chilling. And then you talk to them, it's like, huh? Like it's just, and it's like something like that. It's just like, wow, this is on one hand so different because like we don't have wine culture in America because it became more beer culture in America, but it's so familiar. And then also the sense of humor seemed very similar, which was very self-deprecating and a little raunchy and like naughty and very down to earth. So yeah, it is very interesting.
The Pfalz, I believe, and also like along the Rhine in southwestern Germany, is like the only place in Germany that's warm enough for uh, making wine. So
Uh-huh.
that's probably why that's so like big intertwined in their culture. It must have probably been a shock when they came to Pennsylvania and didn't have the opportunity anymore to do
Yeah,
like big wine business.
I heard too that, and I don't know, so people please double check this, but I heard too that as the identity formed around Germany in the 1800s, wine became more prominent too, because of course beer and wine are both exist. um but yeah, it's very, I mean, I like that. I wish we Pennsylvania Dutch had more wine culture. That'd be fun. But because I was Mormon growing up, I didn't experience any of that because my family was very polite and didn't drink around us because Mormons aren't supposed to drink. So
Mm. To delve even deeper into PA Dutch folk magic, um, when you generally, if you look up just German folk magic, not just specifically anything, but just German folk magic, the first thing that will usually come up is Braucherei, even if you look for folk magic from within Germany. And that was my experience when I started researching German folk magic more in depth. I constantly got referred to PA Dutch folk magic, and I was confused because that's over in America. Like, what does that have to do with us? And the term Braucherei, as a German speaker, doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. It just means like custom, basically.
yeah.
Uh, and I couldn't like make sense of that. So my question to you is, for anyone else who was like as confused as I was, how would you describe what Braucherei is and what is kind of the history behind that term?
Okay, so it definitely also means custom, or it also means like need, like when you
Mm,
need something. In Pennsylvania Dutch as well. And it's actually like a euphemism because these are things you don't really talk about out loud. And it's interesting, there's kind of different histories of how folk magic got changed over time in Catholic areas versus in Protestant areas. And that's actually a big difference between Pennsylvania Dutch culture and then the culture of Southwest Germany today, because all the Protestants left and went to Pennsylvania. So there's a little bit of difference there. Um, so in the Protestant cultures, rather than being enveloped into saint days and fully synchronized into the Catholic customs, that it remained kind of underground and parallel and a little bit secret. It was something you definitely don't talk about. So there were other euphemisms people use as well, like this would be in Dutch, but oh, there's someone who eats more than bread, something like that. So I don't know if that means they eat vegetables, but whatever. I'm thinking. But so that is why it's such a general term. And then the history is that before the modern era, people didn't have doctors and stuff to go to. And so you would have people in the village who specialized in folk healing. And those practices would have been happening in Germany as well. And then they were brought to the Americas. And there's actually a kind of folk saint. Her name is Mountain Mary. Her name was Anna Maria Jung, who is considered kind of the one who brought Braucherei to the Americas. And she's still known in the culture today. And that's a little, it's a folk history. We don't really know if she did that or not. But so that's how it got brought to America, and it was just what everyone did because you need to survive. And originally it would have been more intertwined and more medicinal and intertwined with midwifery. But then over time, as people got access to modern medicine, that dwindled a little, and it became more the verbal charms, the written charms, and all the little folk magic aspects of the medicine became more prominent versus like the herbalism and the medical knowledge. And then that did it in the 1950s, 1940s, the Pennsylvania Dutch started to get more of a tourism thing. And so that kind of brought a lot of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture into the modern zeitgeist, because it was very interesting at that point, because especially with the Anabaptists, it was like a little time capsule of the 1700s, the way they dress, the way they live. And so that was very fascinating to people. And even though the English and the Scots had similar folk customs, the Pennsylvania Dutch were the ones who kind of kept them the longest, probably because they had their insular language and community. And so I think that's why Braucherei is so well known. I mean, the same thing happened for me when I wanted to get into German folk magic. And at first I was like, oh, that's boring. Didn't want to. Now I know I was wrong. But yeah, it is kind of funny how the Pennsylvania Dutch have taken up that space.
I also came across when reading through like German sources on folk magic, specifically that came from Baden-Württemberg, which is like in southwestern Germany. They mention also like laws against the practice called Brauche, which I mean is eerily similar in name to Braucherei. So I think that there's definitely a connection there, especially when considering the geographic closeness to the Palatinate region.
Yeah, and I have like one side of my Pennsylvania Dutch family is from Baden-Württemberg, and it is something very interesting because it was underground. So I have a couple notes here so I can go over the actual qualities of Braucherei and what it involves. So the main tool is going to be your voice, so whispered incantations, blessings, including Christian blessings. They do something called speaking off illnesses. So you are talking to the illness to speak it off. And then there's also different hand gestures that would be part of these rituals. Another common aspect of the folk magic is writing down charms and carved charms. I think the blessings like the house blessings, the baptismal blessings, and marriage blessings that are written down in the Folktales are kind of an extension of that. And then people will also do things like, write down the Sator square and wear it on your body, or eat it, or feed it to your cow who isn't producing milk, whatever it is. Then for books, you have the Bible and almanacs. And this is actually the Pennsylvania Dutch use of the Bible became very influential in America in general. And a lot of these things, we'll probably get into that, but they influenced American folk magic in general to a pretty big degree. And then herbalism's a big part of this. And one of the most prominent plants in Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic is the elder tree and all the different parts of it. And some of the stories and folklore got brought, and even things that are kind of like extreme, like people still, I know of people who still will put their baby's placenta under the elder tree, things like that. And then you have the kind of folk saints. So of course you have the Trinity that are invoked in a lot. Oh, with books, I forgot to say, there's a book called The Long Lost Friend that came out in the 1800s, and it was really influential. And so that's like the most common written source. Now, when it comes down to Braucherei, because of that secrecy and that it was illegal and things like that, a lot of it, there's verboten about writing it down. So you're not supposed to write it down. It's only word to mouth, or word, I don't know how you say that. But so that's kind of like a parallel thing. It's definitely The Long Lost Friend was very popular in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But then when it comes to Braucherei itself, being called, so a female practitioner would be Braucherin, and a male practitioner would be Braucher. And when it comes to being a Braucherin, that is a closed practice, and you need to be initiated into that, and that is an oral practice. But then there's the wider folk magic, and that the Long Lost Friend would be part of that. And then like within Braucherei, there are certain like what they might call helpful spirits that there's euphemism there. So one that probably is very familiar to you is the Three Sisters.
Yeah.
Who come up a lot in folk charms. The folklore of the Pennsylvania Dutch is very similar to German in that it's like very fixated on witches. And then as far as folk saints, Saint Gertrude's really prominent, and everyone kind of has their own theories about synchronization, because the way Saint Gertrude comes into our culture is very reminiscent of more of a deity or something ancient than just like a random saint. And she, her feast day, which is this March 17th, there are common customs of like baking. It's called Dutch. It's a bread that you include. It's like a wet bread that's made rather than a dough. It's made from like a batter, and you put in all the herbs you want to grow really well. So all the herbs that are abundant in the early spring. So it's kind of like a folk magic practice of like calling in that abundance. And you will take that and you eat it on that day, but you also sprinkle it in the fields for some people even have the concept of the little corner people, which is like the land spirits of your garden. There's a lot of household spirits. There's like the little humpback man who's always involved in everything, and there's a little woman who's in charge of your oven and your hearth. So little fairies, I think that's like kind of covers that. Mount Mary, we talked about. Saint Hildegard von Bingen is huge, because in our culture she's a saint. She's not officially a saint, but she was always a folk saint. And is Bingen in the faults? I think
I should know this. I don't. Let me just look it up.
Like
I don't know much about South German geography, so
kind of near Worms. I'm always researching such old stuff that like it's not up to date with like where things are considered to be in Germany today.
So I've just looked it up, and it is in more like southwestern Germany, the southwestern German area. It's like a bit north of the Palatinate.
Oh, okay, okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. So, um, and then the last thing is like there's a big focus on natural magic, herbalism, and then also all the farmer rules. That's probably the most common way that people would have heard is all the weather and farmer rules. There's a lot of things about like, oh, how many snowfalls there are between a certain date and Christmas. That's what the weather will be like in the year. There's just tons of that. And some of them, it's interesting. Last year I saw one in one of my books of all these superstitions. There was like, if the leaves hold on to the trees for a really long time, that mean or the trees hold on to their leaves for a long time before they fall, that means it's going to be a really cold long winter. And that happened last year. The leaves hadn't fallen by New Year's, and it was like the longest winter of my life. I'm like, oh, okay, so some of these are just like observations, I guess.
Okay, that's crazy. For leaves to hold on until New Year's, I like that's crazy to me. Like this concept, uh our trees lose like they kind of get color in August and then they start to lose more and more, and in November it's like gone. So for leaves to
Yeah,
hold on till like New Year's, it's like a wild concept to me. But
yeah, it
that,
was weird. It was weird too, but we all know the weather is
yeah,
messed up
yeah.
for all of us. So we finally got snow today, finally. So
Well, with us it is like I don't know how the weather exactly is in the Pfalz. From what I know, or from what I've heard, it's like the warmest and sunniest place in Germany, which doesn't mean a lot because this is a very unsunny and cold country. So
uh-huh.
if you were to go to the Pfalz, maybe you would find it very cold or something. It's certainly not as dry as most places in the US are. But what I
Mhm.
wanted to say is that we also have like these weather almanacs here, of course, and they are spread throughout Germany from what I know. And my grandparents told me that there used to be this old lady in our village that really held dear these like weather patterns and folklore about the weather. And there is a period in like mid to late May here, which is called the 𝔖𝔨𝔨𝔫𝔨𝔨𝔢𝔫, which means ice saints. And
Mm,
this is like the last period of the year where we can get like really strong frost when the temperatures go below zero. And in that folklore, it is said that you should wait through this ice saint period, and each day has like a special saint, and then you can plant. And
mm.
this woman in our village held to that belief so strongly that even when it was still very cold after the ice saints, she still planted her seeds and was like, well, I don't care if the ground is like frozen solid, I'm still going to plant my seeds here today. So this is like
You got to
still
hold on to something.
exactly.
Yeah, there
Uh,
was one other thing I wanted to say about Braucherei because there's kind of a contradiction because on one hand, it's obviously a Christian practice. The Trinity is well woven throughout the charms, and the people by the time they came to America, they'd been Christian for like 1,000 years or something, and so it's definitely a Christian practice. However, there is some like it is also in sometimes in contradiction to the official church. And when you come up with like the kind of fun folk stories where Brauchers come up, it is always like this thing of like, oh, don't tell the preacher what we're doing. So there's like this parallel thing happened where I think a lot of people are turned off, and I was initially because of our Christian trauma and wanting to find something new. Um, but I think that that is the most outward layer. As you get deeper, everything in the world's older than Christianity in one sense or another. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. It just takes a lot. You have to put the work in and you have to like do enough research and do enough talking to people and coming and familiarity with the folklore, with German folklore and Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. You need to get that level of context before you can start to see the real character of things and some of the more magical or mysterious side of things.
Yeah. Also, I forgot what I wanted to say. Oh yes, I know I remember. Um, the climate in Pennsylvania and southwestern Germany, of course, is different. And I'm wondering, did the Pennsylvania Dutch like adapt their almanacs to this new weather pattern and to this new landscape that they were dealing with, or do you think that they more so kept to their like old traditional German ways of doing things?
So I think there's a little bit of both. I think Pennsylvania, I need to look up because I don't know if there's vineyards in Pennsylvania, but I think Pennsylvania has a pretty similar geography and climate to Southwest Germany. It looks very similar. It has like the rolling hills and Pennsylvania compared to where I am now in Utah, Pennsylvania is a lot more wet and it's very forested. So like and especially back then it was heavily forested. And so I think it was pretty familiar, but a good example of the adaptation is that one of the famous days is Groundhog's Day, which is one of those weather predicting days. So like I think most people have heard of it because there was like an old movie called Groundhog's Day. But that is February 1st. And there's a divination where you take out the groundhog and does he see his shadow? If he does, it means the weather, I don't know which way it goes. If he sees a shadow, then the weather is going to be winter for longer. And if he doesn't see his shadow, then it will get warm faster, something like that. But that actually goes back to an old German tradition where it was a badger. But they don't have badgers in Pennsylvania, so they adapted it with a groundhog. So I think that there's a lot of adaptation that happens, but I think also they really kept a lot of their culture as much as they could. And I think in Pennsylvania a lot of it did apply pretty well. Like the Pennsylvania Dutch have been very successful farmers and their agriculture and things have been very successful. So I don't know, a little of both.
Yeah, actually, I think that tradition with the badger actually is more historically prominent in my area in northwestern
Oh,
Germany. So
really?
yeah, that's why it's really interesting that the Pennsylvania Dutch have like picked that up. And
Uh-huh.
I also think what I also wanted to mention is that a lot of the times when US Americans try to like pinpoint like European climates and stuff to like get a frame of reference, the one thing is that they forget that Europe is a lot more north than most people
Mm,
think. Like
mhm,
most of Germany is like north of like the continental United States. Like we're up in Canada, basically.
mhm,
And another thing is that they try to compare European climates with the East Coast when I think it's more accurate to compare it to the West Coast because you have like California, which is like very dry and hot, which is basically the Mediterranean. And then you
mm,
have like the Pacific Northwest, which is like basically everything which is north of the Alps in Europe. So lots
mhm,
of clouds, lots of rain, um, not much sun generally, and more milder temperatures. So the hots are not as hot and the colds don't get as cold. And this is especially
mm,
prevalent in Western Europe, like Ireland and
mm,
northern
mm.
Spain. And the further east you go, the more continental and extreme the climate gets. So I think I don't
Okay.
know. I'd be curious what your experience would be if you were to come to Germany and experience our weather, but also our landscape here and
Mhm.
how that would kind of relate to what you lived through in the United States. And of course, as an animist, what I'm always interested in is like the land spirits and how does the land feel? And I would be very, very curious what your experience would be with the German land
I
spirits
know, me
here.
too. I'm curious. Something I would say too is that the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, it's a very rural culture. And so when you compare that to Germany, I think most of the time people think about big cities like Berlin when they think about Germany. And so there's going to be a huge difference between Pennsylvania Dutch culture and Berlin. Probably less of a huge, and even like Frankfurt or whatever the big cities in the Southwest are. Stuttgart, I'm probably saying that wrong. But it'd probably be a little more similar to the real rural areas in the Pfalz. Like there'll be more of a similarity, but then at the same time, we went through way different historical pressures. And so that has really changed the way the cultures have evolved. So one thing is that in America, we have the influence of the Puritans. So the Pennsylvania Dutch came to America, and then they found these very strict, rigid forms of Christianity. So that influenced the Pennsylvania Dutch to be more, to over time become more, I don't know, like purity culture is a really big thing in America, and being more judgmental about nudity or sex or things like that. I know that from what I've heard from my friends, it's like shocking to hear like the attitude that the very chill attitude people have towards those things in Europe. It like growing up in America, it can be such a purity culture bubble that it's like, oh.
Yeah, Germany has a lot of like nudist culture as well.
Uh-huh. And also just that it seems like a lot more chill about just being like, this is a part of life. And so we're going to teach our kids to be safe, but we're not going to like freak out about it. And we're going to let them have those experiences and trust them that it's supposed to happen and they can experiment. And however, I do think from the old material, it does seem like in the old Pennsylvania Dutch material, you do see you're like, oh, they have some like rowdy customs. Like there were certain customs of when you were dating somebody that you could sleep over at their house. And I hear that's still kind of like a common thing in that it's like, yeah, they can stay here or there, whatever, if you're dating as a teenager. But I feel like in the greater American society, that's like pretty scandalous. Like, um, uh, so I think that Pennsylvania Dutch culture became more American, obviously, over time, and has integrated with that American sensibility. And then the other big difference is like the proximity to the wars. So the Revolutionary War was a big turning point for the Pennsylvania Dutch, and there's still a lot of ghost stories about the Revolutionary War. And that was really kind of when the Pennsylvania Dutch like trauma bonded to the concept of America, obviously. And but then we didn't have to go through the same, we were so far away from the world wars that we didn't have the same negative effects. We didn't have the same loss of life, destruction of our area. So we really missed a lot of that. And I think that also, from what I can tell from thousands of miles away, it seems like the world wars really had a like disenchanting effect on European populations, and that there became a real different attitude towards tradition and Christianity with a lot of people because of that, because it made you question everything, because it's just like, from what I can tell, and obviously correct me, but a lot of these wars are justified for religious reasons, and that created a certain level of dissonance where people are like, I don't think this was God's will. And more questioning, whereas in America, we've kind of kept with that. In general, it's changing now, but we've kept with that a more religious attitude in general, and a more, maybe you could consider it backwards attitude towards religion. So that's a big difference. And then I also wanted to mention that even though America's far away from Germany, when we go into the 1800s, books are passing back and forth and people are passing back and forth. And so there's always been communication with Germany. And so when you have things like the work of the Brothers Grimm's, both their fairy tales, but also their collections on German mythology, and culture and customs, those were really influential in Pennsylvania as well. And then the material, the same kind of often very questionable historicities of the Romantic era, those also had an effect on the Pennsylvania Dutch. So that if you read stuff from the 1800s, you're going to see similar kind of probably ahistorical assumptions that you would see in the Romantic era. And so they're interpreting it through kind of the same lens because they're getting the same books. Um, and even things like the whole Ostara thing, that Ostara story with the rabbits that comes from the 1800s, that's like a pseudo history or mythology that comes from Pennsylvania and then like influences. So even though there are differences, there are a lot of similarities as well.
Yeah, two things that I wanted to say what you about stuff that you mentioned. First, the disenchantment in Europe after the Second World War. Yes, that's definitely like true in my experience. Like, I don't know if Americans necessarily realize that the war is like a very still kind of recent event in our history, and we all have living relatives, or most of us have living relatives who lived through that. And for example, my grandparents were like tiny children when all of that went down. And my grandfather, because he was a very nosy child, he kind of poked the adults all the time and wanted to hear like stories from what was going down.
Mm.
And he told me that he witnessed like basically war criminals, like German soldiers, which were like involved in like all of the genocide that Germany was perpetuating at the time, going to the church and then getting their like um, blessing and forgiveness from the priest there, and then basically walking away free men. Because the thing is, what I think also many don't realize is that the persecution of like Nazis in Germany after the Second World War wasn't necessarily as thorough as many might think. Of course, the worst of the worst got like their trials in Nuremberg, but many also later went into the West German government, for example. And even
Mm-hmm.
others still retained their jobs at universities and stuff. And this was also like a very big difference to how things were handled in East Germany, for example, where more people got tried. So this is one thing that I can see having led to this like breakdown in relations between the public sphere and religion because of the like what do you say it? Because the church wasn't like turned a blind eye to what was happening, and
Yeah,
in many cases
that
even encouraged it.
when you told that story, I like felt a pit in my stomach. But and I mean that's also in a very tiny way parallels what I saw, and it's like seeing it on that big scale. I think World War One too, part of it is that war became mechanized. So you had it was so much more damaging than it had been in the past because you have machine guns and terrible gases and all this technology that just like put it on this scale. I mean, I only know this from like the books that they have me read in school, like All Quiet on the Western Front and everything. So
Yeah. And the second thing that I wanted to mention is the exchange that you talked about between the Pennsylvania Dutch and Germany. And I think in that time also like the long lost friend came over to Germany.
mm,
And I have like a copy of the original manuscript in my bookshelf. And of course, it was like written in German in Fraktur and stuff. And the thing with the original manuscript is that a lot of the pages aren't necessarily in the best quality. So there are like
mm,
splotches of inks in some pages, and things are maybe a bit hard to read. So I bought that and got together with my mother and my grandmother, and then we sat together and like translated everything
uh-huh,
um, from like Fraktur to like things that you could actually like read. And
mm-hmm,
this was like a bonding experience. And what I noticed is that this entire book, I mean, it was written in German, but it also felt really German. Like it didn't feel like this was an American writing from a German
mm-hmm,
American perspective, because
mm-hmm,
also German places are mentioned in that book, and also like German folklore is also like
Mhm.
mentioned in one spell or something. So it really did not feel like I was connecting to something foreign, but more that I was connecting to something that was very much home to me.
Yeah, and I think especially like now today, if you go to Pennsylvania, you'd really have to get to a very specific rural area to experience that culture, because we have you're going to find McDonald's, you're going to find the like normal American culture. But back when everyone was speaking Dutch, it was very much that way. And then as I have studied both the German folk magic back in Germany and then the Pennsylvania Dutch material, it feels home like that too. It's almost like, honestly, I would think of Pennsylvania Dutch as a just separated further in space, but it's just like a dialect of German, just like anything is, like Falsish is, like Swiss German. So you're further away, it's going to be more different and had different influences, but especially back then. I think though Hoffman, who wrote The Long Lost Friend, also was an immigrant from Germany, so it would have been very fresh.
Mm.
And I know his wife, he got a lot of material from his wife, and she was like a German Catholic.
Uh,
I can't remember where they're from though, but I think, I don't know. I
yeah,
need to look.
that probably also explains a bit more of why it felt so familiar, because of course there's this bit Catholic influence, and my region in the north is Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
which we're kind of outliers with that. Like the rest is Protestant around us, which led to some like
Uh-huh. Oh.
interesting rivalries between villages here.
Uh-huh.
Um, but you already talked about being living in Utah currently, and
Mm-hmm.
what the thing is with that, you're kind of a diaspora of a diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm wondering is, um, are there like any specifically German diaspora communities that already lived within Utah? And is their folk magic probably similar or different than the one that is practiced in Pennsylvania? And have you had any like trouble adapting your Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic practice to this new environment?
So when you sent me the questions, this is the one I had to think the most deeply about, because on one hand, I've always been going back and forth my whole life between Utah and Pennsylvania. So I was born in Utah and lived here most of my life, but as a child, we would always go to Pennsylvania in the summers. So it was always like, yeah, this is where my mom's from. And it also was home to me. And then I moved to Pennsylvania and lived there in high school, and then I would go back in the summers. But then I was going to school in Idaho and Utah, so it's back and forth, back and forth. That's kind of like who I am. So that has always been my lens, and I've always been comparing Pennsylvania and Utah in my head, because I remember we would drive across the country. It's a very, very far away. Utah is very far away from Pennsylvania. If you drive straight, it's like 40 hours straight of driving.
As a European, that is insane to me. That's like straight up insane. Like I can drive like maybe an hour and I am in the Netherlands. So driving
Yeah.
40 hours straight, no,
Yeah.
sorry.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's like basically the Middle East for Germany. So, um, but I remember, because Utah has a very interesting climate, as to get into it from an animist perspective, that's important. Utah has a mixed climate where I am, where it's a desert, it's very deserty, but then the mountains, we have the Rocky Mountains here. And so the mountains create a mountain ecosystem, and they also, where I live in Utah, historically, it got really messed up by the settlers messing everything up. But it was like an oasis. We have big lakes. We have the Great Salt Lake, and we also have Utah Lake, that were like an oasis in the desert. And we also have a similar seasonal pattern where we have a hot summers and cold, snowy winters. So there's still that seasonal turn that's a little bit different, but familiar. And because of that, the folk magic stuff adapts to some degree. But I didn't get interested. I haven't been back to Pennsylvania. I'm hopefully going, and knock on wood, going this summer. So I haven't been back to Pennsylvania in quite a while. So this whole pagan part of my life has been in Utah. And so I've always been doing the adaptation. And I think also something to understand about the Pennsylvania Dutch is that even though there's that core in Pennsylvania, it is a fuzzy boundary because people initially came because there was a lot of available farmland at that time, and then over time that filled up, so people would come to Pennsylvania and then they would move further out. And so you even had, I would kind of, I've seen people kind of even consider areas of Canada and areas of the Midwest part of that Dutch diaspora, although it gets watered down. And then they didn't speak German as long. Like in the Midwest, and in like Minnesota and stuff, there was a time that the newspapers were in German, but that ended earlier, like in World War I, because they didn't have as deep of roots and they weren't as insular as Pennsylvania. So on one hand, it is a diaspora of a diaspora, but on the other hand, it feels very natural. And I even came across this story. There's one of my favorite books called Once Upon a Hex, and it's a collection of stories from Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. And one of the stories is about these two brothers, Pennsylvania Dutch brothers. Actually, there's three, and they're moving west and they come in contact with the Mormons, and one of them decides to join the Mormons, or two of them decide to join the Mormons. One thinks that's a bad idea, and then one decides to move to Utah with the Mormons, and then the other one thinks that's a bad idea, and so they get in a giant fight and they kill each other. And then they're haunting Illinois, this hill in Illinois, for anyway. So, and reading that, I was like, oh, I feel so seen. And like, so I think that feels very natural to me. And I remember when we would drive those long drives, I'd fall asleep and then I'd wake up and we were in Pennsylvania or like Illinois, somewhere closer. And it was like in what is it called? The Wizard of Oz, when it goes from black and white to color, because it goes from desert to like everything's green and it feels like it's burning my eyes. It's so green. And so going back and forth was always a part of my life. And the folk magic in Utah, there is not really a German diasporic community in Utah. Utah's like weirdly English and Scandinavian because of the Mormon history. So it's even more like English and Scandinavian than the regular United States. But we do have folk magic because like Joseph Smith, who started the Mormon church, was actually really into folk magic. And some things that would be similar, like he would do the kind of talismanic magic and things that involved the planetary things, and also Masonic rituals. But I haven't gotten into it that much from that perspective. I do feel like sometimes I find it difficult talking about my spiritual path because the people who've left the church know about the folk magic and they see that as a reason to discredit Joseph Smith and everything. So the fact that I'm into it now is kind of like why would you be into that nonsense? But probably all of us get that to some degree. But then as far as like how it affects my practice, I think that a big effect, because I live in the Rocky Mountains and animistically, that's my home. That is my teacher. I live close to a mountain called Mount Timpanogos that has like a really beautiful native story, because it looks like there's a woman laying on top of the mountain. And there's a story about her and how she ended up there. And those mountains are really my spiritual home. And because of that, I think I gravitate even more to the Southern German and folklore and the folklore of the Alps, because that is actually very similar to the mountains in Utah. And even like we have an area in Utah called Alpine, because that's kind of just a word that means that kind of rocky mountain. So I think because of that, I'm initially more drawn to Frau Bertha and the Perchten, even more than it shows in my ancestry or the specific history of the Pennsylvania Dutch, because that resonates with the landscape I live in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you probably would like be then best IRL friends with Ella Harrison, who is like in southern Germany and near the Alps. I
Uh-huh.
think she can see the Alps from her window.
Uh-huh.
So so
Yeah,
it
I can see the Rocky Mountains from like my street too. There's a building at my window, but I think my front window I can see them. So
as like a northern German with like no mountains anywhere like near me, this is like a crazy thought. I to like see mountains and like see them covered in snow when I look outside my window, it's like my mind can't comprehend that. I
yeah, Utah actually was a prehistoric lake that they call Lake Bonneville. So there's actually a lot of dinosaurs and fossils here because dinosaurs would like fall into the lake and be buried in the sediment. So it's actually like if you imagined a giant bowl surrounded by mountains, that's the valley I live in. So there's actually, I'm really close to what's called the Wasatch Front of mountains, but there's 360 degrees of mountains all around me because I'm in the bottom of this lake.
was on holiday in Austria once in the Austrian Alps and waking up every day and seeing like the horizon like not visible and everything covered in mountains like you just described like kind of drove me insane after a week
It did.
because
That to me feels cozy. I was like, that's normal. If I can see too far, I'm like, I'm not being held by the earth. I'm just alone here. I'm gonna fall off the earth, I think.
these are just like very interesting regional differences. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and another thing that you already talked about a bit is the indigenous people of the
Mm-hmm.
US. And as a diaspora community there, they live on stolen land, and the Pennsylvania
Mm-hmm.
Dutch community has developed on stolen land. And I'm wondering how that impacted the culture.
Okay, so the Pennsylvania Dutch have a little bit, especially in the very early days, they have a pretty unique history because in Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Dutch lived, it's South Central Pennsylvania, and the native people there are called the Lenape. And initially, like the history that happened here, by the time the Pennsylvania Dutch came, the Lenape's lifeways had already really been disrupted. And so initially, when William Penn founded Pennsylvania, initially he had a much more kind attitude towards the natives than the surrounding states or colonies at the time. And so the Lenape initially stayed in their land, but over time, the permanent settlements made their lifeways pretty impossible because they had a I don't know what the actual technical term is, but the type of agriculture where you live in one spot, like following rivers, you live in one spot until it doesn't get fertile, then you move somewhere else. But you can only do that if there's like a low population, because if people start settling permanently, there's nowhere to move when you need to. And interestingly, I remember certain like Wolf-Dieter Storl saying certain things about like America and Germany and the Neolithic people in Germany and America and thinking like this is new age nonsense. But now I'm like, oh, he has somewhat of a point with the Lenape, at least with like the Northeast, that there is some similarities to the lifeways of those people and then like the Neolithic people very long ago in Central Europe,
Yeah,
like following rivers and having semi-permanent agricultural setups.
yeah.
So yeah.
Actually, I wanted to interject something. Um,
Uh-huh.
I study archaeology at university, and my
Mhm.
focus is on Central Europe. And a lot of the times, what we'll do is when we have archaeological finds, we try to seek for some type of comparison. And we'll usually then look for some like indigenous communities who still live in their traditional ways, or at least semi-recently have still traditions passed down. And a lot of the times, we will see like striking similarities to, for example, North American indigenous populations. And
Mm-hmm.
the period in which, like, at least in Central Europe, communities started to be more permanent in their settlements and got rid of that semi-nomadic lifestyle is actually quite recently in history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like even after the Neolithic period, even into the Bronze Age, people still didn't have like settlements which lasted more than maybe like 3 or 4 generations. And
Wow.
And this is also something that we see like the Romans describe, that uh,
Okay.
at least Germanic settlements were like very spread out. And
Mm-hmm.
after the after the Romans like left and uh, Germany got Christianized over time, this is when we kind of start to see like more permanent villages form around churches
Oh,
in like the early
wow.
medieval period.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so there is some truth to it, but I'm very certain. I know that a lot of like authors, especially like in the occult community, try to like romanticize that and try to draw the
Mhm.
comparison too far into like very
Yeah.
problematic territory. But I
Well, and
just
I
want
I love Wolf Dieter Storl so much. He's like my surrogate grandpa in my own head. But there's this grain of salt situation with all of the authors because it's like as soon as it's so important to compare different cultures. However, once you get into more academic research, you realize you know academics can only speak with a high level of certainty about their specialty, so the more comparisons and the more things you're drawing from, although that can get really interesting and be very creative and like get our mind going, it's also something you always want to take with a grain of salt and look further into and see, okay, so he has a point here, doesn't have a point there, but he actually looks a lot like my dad. And then I found out he's from the same area of Germany that my dad's family's from in Saxony. I was like tripping out one day staring into his eyes. I'm like, I feel like I'm tripping. You're my grandpa. And so,
yeah.
yeah. So in Pennsylvania, what ended up happening was the very early settlers, and I don't want to romanticize this because this is a short period of time. However, I think it's important because it kind of gives us a different playbook than what happened in most of America, that the early Lenape intermarried a lot with the Pennsylvania Dutch. So if you go to like the Lenape tribal nation, their website, they talk about it. They talk about how a lot of them are mixed ancestry with the Pennsylvania Dutch settlements. And then there was in those early days, especially when it comes to the land-based practices and herbal practices and lore and medicinal uses, that had a big effect on Braucherei and the very early settlers. And so I think that there is something really beautiful there, but then it's also important to hold space for the fact that that time when the Lenape were free in Pennsylvania was very short, after Pennsylvania began to exist, and that eventually that the people who came into power after William Penn followed the trend of the rest of the United States, and they did get displaced, unless they were integrated into the local settler communities. So I don't know, it's a very interesting and unique um story, and I think it is something beautiful and that we need to just like give that the props it deserves, because when you think about country people and people living off the land moving to a new place, it makes a lot of logical sense to talk to the people who know what's up and be like, okay, so what plants can we use here? How do you survive? So yeah.
And another thing about that is that I've heard that in English, Pennsylvania Dutch Braucherei is also often referred to as powwow, which
Mhm.
I believe is a term that was borrowed from some indigenous communities. So do you know more
Yeah.
about that?
So, okay, so if you're not familiar with like Native American culture, I'm not sure which exact tribe specifically or which nation the term powwow comes from. But now, if you go to a Native American powwow, that is their big cultural event. So everyone dresses in their regalia, they do their traditional dancing and selling their uh, um, handiwork, and everyone in the community gets together. They're really beautiful. I've gotten to go to powwows here in Utah, and everyone, every age of the community, they all get dressed in their regalia and they're all performing together. It made me emotional the first time I saw it because I don't feel like we have anything like that in dominant American culture where the whole community comes together um, and is celebrated in that way. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the Pennsylvania Dutch powwow, because Pennsylvania Dutch powwow is just that very familiar to anyone who knows German folk magic in Germany, very similar to that. And using the Bible, things like that. It was just, I think people talk about where did that come from? There's all sorts of folk etymologies, but I think it's just kind of like how English just borrows so many terms. And Braucherei is a mouthful for an English speaker. Like it's very hard. And I remember even for a while, it took me a while to get used to hearing some of the Pennsylvania Dutch terms and like for them to make sense and hear them. And even like my partner, I'm always talking about all this stuff. And I'm like, Braucherei, Raunacht, all these things. And he's like, oh, what are you talking about? I'm like, you need to know this now. I've been doing this for like 4 years. You need to know the name. But I think it's just an English loan word. And so even as people stopped speaking German, then powwow became the most common way you would talk about it. You also hear the term hex doctor in some areas, not in the like heart of Pennsylvania Dutch culture, but in some outer areas. So yeah, now I think the intent isn't the intent behind powwow and the way it was used, it wasn't necessarily appropriative, but now in the 21st century, it's just not a sensitive way to talk about it. And now more and more people are using like, realizing and reclaiming and reconnecting with the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. And so Braucherei is coming more into popularity again.
That's interesting to hear. And I have a point on our outline, which I just wrote like, do you have any questions for me or anything like that? And
Uh-huh.
I specifically wrote that point because I've been like interrogating you and satiating my own curiosity all this
Uh-huh.
time. And I wanted to like give you the opportunity to like do the same to me and like ask me anything that you might have questions about as a person living in the German diaspora for like a non-German diaspora person.
Yeah. Okay, so it actually what we talked about diaspora and my experience with Utah and Pennsylvania, I'm really curious about your experience because I know you talk about Northwest German folk magic and that's where you live, but then I don't know if it's your whole family or a significant amount is from Silesia.
Mhm.
And so I'm really curious about your experience as you've dug into and connected to the folk magic, how it's different, your experience with the Northwest land spirits, and then also the material from Silesia. Like, how are those relationships the same or different?
I'm way deeper connected to the spirits here, and this is like where my deepest roots
Mhm.
lie. I speak Low Saxon. I do not speak Silesian. I I know the land spirits here very well. I've interacted with them. This is also where now my ancestors are buried. So this
Mm-hmm.
is my home, basically. Silesia is also kind of my home. Like it still feels like home when I look at pictures and hear stories, but it's very distant to me. And in a lot of ways,
Mm-hmm.
this might reflect some experiences that the German American diaspora has in the United States, because
Yeah.
there the distance is even greater, like in two separate
Mm-hmm.
continents. And it has been like kind of difficult to reconstruct a Silesian folk practice, but in some ways it is similar because it also involves a lot of saint work, especially around Mary.
Mm-hmm.
But in other ways, some things just do not show up in Silesian folk magic that show up in Northwestern German folk magic. For example, here where I
Mm-hmm.
live now, divination through visions is very big, especially during the Rauhnächte right now. And
Mm-hmm.
this isn't necessarily a thing in Silesia. There, the focus is more on herbal magic and herbal healing. And there was like a specific term that practitioners over there had, like Wurzelmann, I think it's called. And there's also
Mm.
a Slavic name for that. I talk about this topic in my video that I did with the Polish folk witch, because she's also from
Mm-hmm.
Silesia, and we kind of got to compare notes over there. And there, the magic is very like herb centric and mountain spirit centric, whether here it is more divination centric and bog spirit centric.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's interesting because I definitely relate a lot to that, especially when it comes to researching Germany, because there's all these different levels, because you have the level of people who, in America, people will say, I'm German, I'm Italian, and we kind of understand people are talking about their heritage unless there's more context clues. And I know that causes problems online. But a lot of that, people who haven't really invested significant amounts of time or weren't born into families that still had some level of the language or had more recent immigrants, there is this level of like a fantasy about the old country, as people will call it. But then so like I feel talking about a connection to a place I've never felt, like I don't want to like step on any toes. And I do feel like there's something real that I've experienced. However, it is like you said, it feels very distant. It's harder, it's obviously harder to connect with, and I have to find ways that it overlaps with, the landscape I'm in here for it to really make sense. A big difference is that in Utah, there's more folk magic and folk culture in Pennsylvania by a large amount, and even in other areas in the East Coast, like the Appalachian Mountains, where they applied their lens of understanding local land spirits to the new place they are. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, there's a mountain called the Hexenhof,
Mm.
and the Witch's Mountain, and there's stories about that. And there's another one, I don't remember the dialect name, but like the Coxhead Mountain, which is like a frisky place, Lover Lane type place.
Mm.
So there's more of that kind of a familiar folklore in the land than what we have in Utah, because we have a very unique, where Utah was settled largely by this religion, Mormonism. The Mormonism subsumes all of that. And that's actually like a big part of my journey has been, I remember being a child, and it's like you have those animist eyes as a child, but then as you grow up, if like me, you grew up in a very strict religious community, you don't get language around that. You don't get words to put to the connection you're having with these plants and animals and places. And then for me, as I got older, all of that kind of atrophied and got put into the back. And I'm like, I have my list of scriptures I can recite. I'm supposed to be sharing the Book of Mormon with my friends, stuff like that. And needing to fit in culturally, if you don't have those stories, that part of your mind kind of atrophies. And I think about it a lot, especially thinking about like Western, the little children brought along with the settlers, and they're having their own experiences in this new place that never got written down, that never got experienced. So that's something I think about a lot. But then when it comes to Pennsylvania and connecting with that, that's a lot easier for me to connect with because like you said, how Silesia, there's something that feels like home while it's also foreign. And that's a very familiar feeling to me because Pennsylvania feels like home in a really deep way, that even though I'm more familiar with Utah, I've spent a lot more time in Utah. There's something very deep and old that feels like Pennsylvania's home. And also I think Pennsylvania is more similar to the areas of Germany that my family was from, and more in the continent, not the temperate areas where it's a little more hot and cold. And yeah, that's super interesting though. And I think too, I've experienced that with the kind of different folk. I don't know, it's interesting because on one hand, every place has its own character 100%. But then on the other hand, I see communing in nature and spending time in nature. I've experienced that it kind of opens up an interdimensional kind of connection as well. And I have felt that in the mountains here, I can feel Frau Bertha, and that isn't because they're her mountains, they're not her mountains, but it's because that is a spirit that I connect with, and I'm in mountains, you know, if that makes sense. I kind of think about it too. There's this, I think I got the concept from a 𝔖𝔬𝔢𝔨𝔢𝔫𝔨𝔢𝔫 book, where this idea as the wild as a spiritual meeting room where like portals to the other world can open up. So there is this kind of like strangeness, but that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I feel too, as somebody who is a folk magic practitioner in Utah, I feel like a lot of that work is work I'm actively doing all the time. Like that is just the character of being a folk magic practitioner in diaspora, is that you have to be learning and changing. And it's like with one hand you're reaching back to the past, and with the other hand you're finding a way into the future and where you are now, and it's like always combining them. That's just my lot in life, I guess. And I feel very like there's part of me, maybe someday I'll move back to Pennsylvania. I do love it, but it is a culture shock for me because where I'm from in Pennsylvania, it does have a Germanic culture. It has, people are a lot more cold initially because that kind of warm, cozy family feeling, you have to be invited in to get that. And it takes longer to make friends, and people are a lot more negative. But it's funny because I never fit in anywhere because my mom, I grew up in Utah with an East Coast mom, but her mom actually was from the West Coast. So there's this like multiple generation of mixing, and I always end up speaking my mind. Like I'm a lot more blunt than normal Utahns, and like throw people off because I'm just going to tell it like I see it, like someone from Pennsylvania. And I'm like the most negative person in Utah, but then when I go to Pennsylvania, I feel like I have to balance out their negativity, and I become really positive. So it's interesting. But I think like I also feel very like with my Mormon history and the history of colonization here and my relationship to the land here, it's like I feel like my ancestors have been running away for so long, and I'm tired of running away. And I feel like I have an obligation to some extent to the land here, to know it and to do what I can to change the culture and protect it, and to be someone who cares and puts that effort into a place rather than just being like, oh, this isn't good for me personally right now, so I'm gonna leave, you know?
Yeah. And I think we've just about covered almost every point that we had in the outline. But lastly, I also wanted to ask you, is there like anything about PA Dutch folk culture that you personally would want to share? And this could be like a quick spell, a quick piece of folklore that you really like, or a cultural practice that you enjoy.
Okay, so I have two things. One's super tiny. One is just a really fun, one of the many elderberry folklore is that if you take, this is a Pennsylvania Dutch thing, if you take the leaves of an elder plant and put them in your back pocket while you're working in the summer, you won't chafe. So, and I heard that works. I haven't tried it yet, but I heard it works. And then the other thing is there's a story called the Meestergeist. So that's like Meistergeist, the ghost master. And this is a story, basically I'll tell it very quickly, but the story is that back in the old place, in a city called Heidelberg, there is a place where the river comes by the city and there's a giant kettle under, or it's not a kettle, there's a big cave under the water that gathers all the muck. And when the devil heard that the Pennsylvania Dutch were leaving Germany, he went down to that river in Heidelberg, which I believe is the Neckar River, and he gathered up all that muck that had all of the ghosts that had fallen into that river. It had bodies of hung witches and, you know, people who had died in the war, all those ghosts. He combined them together and made the master ghost, which he gave the power to shapeshift into any form, so it could look like anything, even something in nature, any person, place, thing. And the devil thought he really had one on the Pennsylvania Dutch. He sent this Meister ghost on the ship to America, and it came with us to America. And it did bring all of that haunted, terrible energy. But what the devil didn't realize is there were also little good things that came across. And there were little seeds of joy, little seeds of the positive folk practice and positive spirits. And so who knows what will happen, but maybe yet those good things will grow into something beautiful here. And so that is a story that since I heard it, I didn't tell it the best, but since I heard it, it's kind of given me a framework, of a folkloric framework to think about the terrible traumas that we brought here and then perpetuated on other people here. And that the shadow of white supremacy and all of these things and colonialism. But then also, you know, that doesn't sum up everything. And there is, I think, a possibility for the good seeds to start growing again and for us to learn to be good people on this land. So anyway, that's one of my favorite little stories.
I can totally see why that's your favorite story. I mean, it was very fascinating to listen to, and it also had like almost that animistic aspect to it that kind of described the perpetuation of generational trauma within the family lines that went over to the Americas. And I feel like this is a very powerful, like folkloric motif that then gets like used as an explanation model kind of for Pennsylvania Dutch behavior.
Well, and I think too, there is this level, there's this saying people say that hurt people. And I think for my ancestors who were Pennsylvania Dutch, it was a great opportunity for them to temporarily escape a lot of the suppression and horrible inequality that they had been subject to, because these people were mostly lower class. Later immigrations, once the cities were going in America, more city people came from Germany, but that was later. And the thing is, though, that we have been shaped by that trauma to the point where we recreated it without realizing it. And I even think in certain things like really punishing school systems that are really strict and things like that, you know, those are a trauma that maybe, I don't know, or that's one way to see them, that they're a trauma that then we recreated it. And instead of creating a truly free society, we kind of just made our own freedom and then like, well, whatever other people are doing. And I think that there are older ancestors who remember a time before we settled permanently, that remember a time when we were living more animistically, and these systems of colonial control hadn't defined us so much. And I think that I have had my experience that I do think those also came over with us, or a possibility for connection with them. And I think that they have a lot more in common with Indigenous people. And I think that we have a seed of possibility to transform into something new. So, and maybe old at the same time. Yeah.
It's a really interesting way to look at things. And I'm just checking, and I think we went now through the entire outline. And with that, I want to kind of close this out. But before I do, I just wanted to ask you, is there anything that you still want to share, still want to say, or still want to promote, anything like that?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I'll send you a couple books to put in the show notes. I didn't get into it very much, but there's a really wonderful new selection of folklore that's called how is it? I need to look at it. How does it exactly go? It's like the folklore of the Pennsylvania Dutch by William Woys Weaver, who is one of our real treasured historians. He's actually a food historian, and he's written a lot of books on Pennsylvania Dutch and American cuisine and the folklore he uncovered, because a lot of folklore gets brought in the food. And so he recently last year published a book on Pennsylvania Dutch folklore and fairy tale and magical stories that's just the most enchanting thing. And so I'll give you a link to that. And then Once Upon a Hex is kind of hard to find. But I don't know, I think we covered a lot. I'm really glad we got to have this conversation. And hopefully it's helpful. And I think too, I want to say that the Pennsylvania Dutch, yes, this is a very specific community, a specific diaspora. It is not synonymous with German American. That's a huge category and has many stories. But I think a lot of people maybe want to be drawn to it because there is this intact folk culture that's very rare in German American diaspora. And I just want to encourage people that this is while Braucherei itself and being initiated is a closed practice, the culture is an open practice. And I think that there's a lot to learn from these cultures and how they adapted to the Americas. And I think that you shouldn't hold yourself back just because if you only have one Pennsylvania Dutch ancestor or you don't have any. If you're interested, it is an open book that you can dig into. And I think it could be, honestly, I think it could have a good influence on people who are interested in folk practice, because there is just more material, and then just, take what works and follow those little threads back to whatever works for you.
So thankful that we got to talk. I feel like I could talk to you for like 5 more hours, but
Yeah.
the sun has already set for about 5 hours here.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'll just close this out. Again, thank you for being here. And thank you for everyone who is watching this video. I'll put all the links in the description. And I hope to see you in the next one. And 𝔖𝔭𝔬𝔢𝔨𝔢𝔫𝔫𝔫𝔫